This is a follow-up to another video I did around how to override runtime properties when Nuxt is running inside a container. The problem comes when you have more than a few parameters that you want to override. This Docker command line gets unwieldy very quickly. So how can we make this a more manageable experience? Well, going back to Mike's 87's document on the problem, he talks about externalizing the config to a file that is not built into our application, but is instead served via an HTTP request and is then fetched by the application at startup inside the browser. His article does this for React, so let's go and see if we can do something similar with Nuxt3. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whenever it is that I find you, and welcome back to the channel. So we are going to look at how we can inject more complex configuration values into our Nuxt app. So the first thing to do is to actually create that file, and the place where we're going to place this file is inside of the public folder. So this is where any static files that we want just served via our HTTP server to go. So that seems like a suitable place considering we want to fetch this from our front end. So let's add a config.json in there so we keep it in its own folder. We can just create this as a nice simple JSON file, but this can be as complex as you like, but just for example purposes I'm going to keep it nice and simple. With that in place, what we're going to do is go and create a plugin. So we need a plugins folder, and we'll create a new plugin in here called load config, and it's a client-side only plugin. So we can tell Nuxt that by putting the .client in the file name. And let's just put the boilerplate bits and pieces in here. Inside this plugin, what we're going to do is we are going to utilize the Nuxt hooks, so the lifecycle hooks, and if you look in the docs you'll find these. We're going to hook into the one that's before the app gets mounted. So this will get run once essentially when the browser loads your Vue app, which is a good time for us to inject our config. So we can go and do a fetch and go and fetch from our public folder the config.json. Then we need to do some things when this response comes back. Let's just put in catch in there as well. But what we're going to do inside the then block is if the response is okay, we're going to transform it into a JSON object, and if it's not, we're going to reject the response. So that will eventually then fall into this catch block. Once we've transformed it into JSON, we need another then block to then pick that up and do something further with it. And what we're going to use is the app config aspect of Nuxt to put this config into. App config seems like a suitable place to put your app configuration after all. Now that we've added that into our Nuxt app config, we can come over to one of our views, like the app view for instance, and we can tweak this a little bit. We'll use app config, and then we just need to pull in the app config, and we do that using another composable use app config. So now, just to prove that this hook only runs once, I'm going to create some pages. Page 1 just says it's page 1 and has a link to go to page 2, and page 2 is going to be the converse. So we can just flip-flop between those pages just to prove our point. So let's run this up and see what we get. So let's go to page 1, and we can see that we get development, and then that's our other property. Perhaps we'll tidy up that app view just a smidge. There, and now we can understand exactly what's going on. So our app config has now been injected with our site environment, which has a value of development that's coming from that config file. So let's just quickly dive into the developer tools so that we can see what's going on over here. And let's just put a console.log. So now when we come over here, we see loading config, and one thing that I didn't do was go and change this to have Nuxt page in it. So now we can see we're on page 1 and we've got loading config, and if I just go to page 2, this is page 2, I see no more loading config, so it's literally a one-time deal, and that hook is only fired the once. So now let's have a look at how that works with Docker. So let's go and build our container image. While that's building, I'm going to create in the root of this folder, a config folder, and I'm going to put a staging area and then a config.json in there. So this is my override file, and I can change that to staging. So let's do a Docker run with the volume mount, and then I can do the present working directory /config/staging/config.json. So I'm picking that file, then I've got to specify what file I'm overriding. So inside my container, the app is in the app folder, then it's in the public config.json. So let's just run this up, and let's jump over to our browser, and this is where things start to get a little bit interesting. So as we can see here, the get on localhost 3000 config/config.json did actually take place, but failed, and it fails with an error content length mismatch. So even though it gives us back a 200, the browser won't let us read that information. So if we go and look at the response, we can see the content length is 40. So what is happening here is that if I actually just go and see how many characters this is, we'll see I've got 40 characters selected. So what's happening is at build time, again, we're back to the same problem, that this config file is being picked up by Nitro, and they look at your static files and they pull out some metadata, and part of that metadata is the content length of the file, and they store that statically inside of your Nuxt folder, and that's what it's using inside the container. So even though the actual file, so if I open up a new window and go to config.json, I do actually get the right data, but it still tells me that I'm getting the content length mismatch. The content length should only be 36 and the header is saying 40, and so everything blows up and says, no, I'm not happy with that. You're telling me I should have 40 characters, but I've only got 36 coming back. So this is a problem with the way that Nitro basically caches that metadata about your public folder at build time. It kind of prevents us doing what we're trying to do here, which is a bit of a pain, but let's see if we can work our way through this problem. So what we can do is, instead of serving this config from the public folder, we could create an API instead and serve it via an API call. So let's go and have a look at how we can do that. So let's create a server folder, and inside there, let's create a folder called API, and inside API, let's create a new file called config.ts. And let's just create the boilerplate. And then what we're going to do inside this handler is use the FS library, which is the Node file system library. What this is going to do is read the config.json from a config folder that sits beneath the directory where we're running our application. Let's just put some error handling in here, and let's also put our imports in here. And then to resolve the FS package, we need to npm install types/node. So that gives us our API call that we can reach on /API/config. So now let's go back to our plugin that we created, and now instead of loading it from config.json from the public folder, we're going to make an API call using that fetch to /API/config. Let's just move that file from the public folder, so it's no longer going to be in public config.json. We need to move this up to being inside of config. So inside of public, we can now get rid of that config directory. That tidies up our public directory again. So now let's run this up and see that we can make that API call. So now we can see our call here to API config, which is a 200, and the response is our JSON that we wanted to pass back. And then we can see that represented in the UI. So the API call is all working. So that's good for running in development because it's going to pick the file from here. But when we actually run our build, so now if we do an npm run build, which is what we're going to do when we build our container, this API call needs to find that config folder inside of our build folder. And as we can see inside of the output folder, which is where it gets built to, we've only got the public folder and the server folder. We need a config folder at the same level as public and server so that our API call can succeed. So a way that we can do that is to hook into the build process of Nuxt. And we can do that inside the Nuxt config using the hooks aspect. And all of these hooks are in the documentation, but we're going to hook into the Nitro part of the build after it's created the public assets. And the reason that we're doing it at this stage is because if we do it before, the build process clears out this whole output folder. So if we do it too early, our copy will go into the output and then get deleted, and it still won't be there. This arrow function that we implement for the hook takes or can accept the Nitro parameter. So there's a Nitro object that can get fed into this, which we are going to use. What we need inside of our arrow function is the source folder. So the source folder we can get from the Nitro options and the workspace directory. And then we're going to tack on the config. So that's basically pointing it to this particular folder in our source directory. So that's where we're copying from. We can then put in a destination folder, which again we can get from the Nitro options. It already contains an output directory, which points us to this particular .output folder. So again, we're going to append on /config to that. So we're doing a recursive copy from source to destination. So everything that's under config here gets copied across to output /config. And just so that this works on repeated builds and gives us a nice clean config with nothing hanging around, I'm going to remove it first from the destination. Now the problem we've got is that we've got more inside this config folder now because we've put our staging folder in there. So let's just create a new folder out here called config overrides or some other such name, and let's move our staging into there. So now that keeps our config nice and clean, that it only contains a single config.json and not all of our overrides, because we don't necessarily want to expose all the override properties into our build. What else do we need to do over here? Need to do the imports. Let's go and get those in so that that's all happy. And let's try an npm run build and see what we get. So we can see now inside .output that we've got our .config folder with our config.json. So we can actually run up from that folder and just see that our API call does actually work. So let's refresh that and we can see that we get our API call is a 200 and it's serving our development setting, which we then see in the UI. So now let's have a look at making sure that this all works inside a container. Let's rebuild our container. Let's give it a run up without any override to see what we get. So again, we see our fetch and we're pulling the development one, which is what it comes with by default. So let's stop that. Now if we run up with our override this time, so from the current working directory, config overrides, staging config.json. So we're injecting this file into the container, overwriting essentially the config.json, and we can see that our API call has worked and is now returning the file that we've injected instead of the default one in the container, and we see that inside the UI. So now this means that you can apply as much complex configuration as you can put in any JSON file that will get reflected inside your app config inside Nuxt, and you can reference that wherever you want to across your application. So hopefully you found that useful, and if you did, then please do remember to hit the like buttons below, and if you're not already a subscriber, then why not consider subscribing to the channel for more tips and tricks like this one. Let me know in the comments what you think. I just need to thank my channel sponsors, without whom I wouldn't still be doing these tutorials. It does help me out. And with that, I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.